Hi, everybody. It's Liam Billingham, the co-host of Oeuvre Busters. Before we jump into the show, I just wanted to welcome our special guest hosts for this episode, the fucking bird that wouldn't shut up and the fucking drill that wouldn't stop while we were recording. They were unwelcome additions to the show, but they bring a real interesting milieu to the Oeuvre Busters, and I'm not sure we'll have them back. We haven't made any decisions about that, but it is not looking good for that fucking bird and that fucking drill. Please do me a favor, and if you haven't yet, please rate, review, and subscribe to the show. We are on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, iHeartRadio, SoundCloud. We would appreciate if you subscribe to it in all of those places. Look at the person sitting next to you on the subway. Look at the person sitting across from you at the dinner table as you don't talk, because this is a John Cassavetes themed podcast. Think about how you're not speaking, and instead you should be listening to Oeuvre Busters and just embrace the alienation. We can be found at oeuvrebusters.com. That's where all of the exciting stuff related to the show is going on. Find us on Twitter, Oeuvre Busters. Find us on Instagram, Oeuvre Busters. Email us at oeuvrebusters@gmail.com. Please get in touch. We'd love to hear from you. That's it. Please enjoy the fucking bird and the fucking drill and fucking George Fragopoulos as we talk about faces. Enjoy the show.
I'm George Fragopoulos.
I'm Liam Billingham.
And this
is
Oeuvre Busters. One of these days you're going to be the one that says it, and you're going to say amazingly. Make sure that I just pronounce it correctly.
I believe it's in the Library of Congress.
Otherwise, I'm resigning.
From your post.
from my post. From my honorary post.
This is an exciting day.
Is
it's
it?
Faces Day.
Oh,
yeah,
because it's Faces Day. Because we're kind of like really back on the Cassavetes.
We're through the
train.
The studio film gauntlet.
We are or not? I mean, I think last episode we said we would be discussing The Dirty Dozen, which is actually a year before this.
A year before this.
So eventually we will do an episode on that. Maybe at the tail end of this as a kind of celebratory...
a bonus episode.
Totally.
But it's interesting. You think he made Faces with that Dirty Dozen money?
I have no idea. The Dirty Dozen money.
Because he was nominated for an Oscar.
He was.
For The Dirty Dozen. He's phenomenal in that movie.
Which I've not seen that film. And I don't think I saw it in its entirety when I did see it. Maybe I saw it like on TV at some point.
I've probably only seen it like 45 or 50 times.
Oh, okay. All right. So it's not very fresh in your mind.
I haven't seen it probably... Well, I say that having not seen it since probably the 1990s.
Yeah.
My dad and I used to...
Is that the film that launched you into puberty? Because of the testosterone in that film.
Oh, no, that would be Honey, I Shrunk the Kids.
Oh my God, when the ant dies... Why'd you fucking have to bring that back up? When that ant dies, about 3/4 of the way through the film, spoiler alert, I think that was young George's first brush with death.
I was listening to another podcast the other day that actually brought up this same very topic.
About the dead ant?
Well, they were talking about what a dickhead Rick Moranis' character is, because there's literally a way to cure hunger by shrinking everybody down and they can just eat giant cookies. And he's not sharing that technology.
Yeah, but then everybody would be dying. You only have to eat cookies when you're that small.
No, because you can... Anyway,
the Republicans are like, we're going to give you free food, but it's going to be sugary and bad.
Yeah, well, that's...
Because of the sugar lobby.
Sugar lobby.
So
exciting week. Yeah. Exciting day.
Yeah, by the way, I'm sorry, can I introduce our new sponsor, the Sugar Lobby? Everybody out there.
This episode is sponsored by the Sugar Lobby.
Go out, get your cookies. Just eat sugar. Like in that Chantal Ackerman film.
Which one?
The first one? Where she kind of like, isn't it a bag of sugar? She opens up a bag of sugar and just starts fucking like plowing through this bag of sugar. Do you remember that?
Yeah. G-I-U-G-L, that one. Yeah.
Oh, your French is so beautiful.
It's not. I actually just spaced on
That's why it's called a romance language.
I don't speak... So,
Faces.
So the Sugar Lobby.
We're getting their money.
That's nice that they gave us money. Sorry, I got distracted for a second there by work texts. Let me put my phone. I'm going to put my phone.
I thought you were distracted by your immaculate French.
Oui. Let's talk about Faces.
1968.
1968.
And as you already said, we're kind of back on the Cassavetes train, meaning that now he's once again returned to kind of his indie
Oeuvre.
filmmaking roots, and his kind of oeuvre, Complete Control.
He makes these 2 studio movies.
Right.
He loses.
He makes Johnny Staccato.
He makes Johnny Staccato.
Which is funny too, because once this finished, I was like, I give this 4 out of 5 Johnny Staccatos on
Really?
the Johnny Staccato scale.
I gave it 2.5, but we'll get into it.
We'll get into that, yeah.
Yeah, I think that, from what I understand, he went back to making movies this way because he didn't like studio interference in his process, and boy, does it show in this movie.
It definitely does.
Before we jump into the movie, what'd you think?
So I enjoyed it.
Did you?
Well, okay, so did I enjoy it? Yes. I enjoyed it, I think, as a relic and as a kind of... as a film that is, in many respects, rather influential.
Sure.
There were plenty of moments where I kept looking at the time code.
Sure.
And I was like, huh. And I do think, though, stylistically, it does a lot of really interesting things.
Did you watch it on Filmstruck?
I did, of course.
It's the longest 2 hours and 10 minutes of your life. And I don't mean that not entirely negatively.
Can you believe that there's an even longer cut? There's like a 3-hour cut. In the Library of Congress, next to, actually, it's filed right next to these podcasts.
Interesting, because these are
Cassavetes also related.
The Cassavetes tapes. It's a long 2 hours and 10 minutes. I tried to watch this. I'd never seen this one before. I know. I feel a little guilty because I tried to watch it 2 or 3 years ago, and I got about 20 minutes in. And I was like, "Fuck this movie." And again, it's almost not at all. It's not at all a critique of the movie. There's probably a lot of the 3 people listening to this podcast, 2 of them are probably white fanboys who are like, what the fuck's wrong with this guy?
I'm going to send them an email.
I'm going to send them an angry email. I just don't, I turned it off. I was like...
Because you were bored. Was it the politics of it? Because again, I'm kind of, it's like that kind of like toxic masculinity stuff. It's both kind of...
Well, it's not entertaining in a way that Husbands is, right? Which is like a weird thing to say.
Well, because because Husbands, the 3 of them together are just
they're amazing,
magic. Yeah.
I also don't. Well, so to come back to it, it's a well-made, incredibly. I made a note about this, but I think it's incredibly well shot. Mm-hmm. I think that there's something sad about the fact that it is so raw, but it's so meticulously shot and edited. The editing is crazy,
right?
But we still, it's still hard for people to take because it's so goddamn raw. But yes, it's. I think it's too long by half.
I think it's too long too.
I think it's a solid 90-minute movie.
I did enjoy the parallel stories. I enjoyed the kind of the symmetry of it.
Did you confuse the white dudes at Gina Rowland's apartment?
Did I confuse
there's the first guy who he throws out, and then there's this Freddie, and then
Freddie Draper, by the way, shared cinematic universe.
Has to be a reference for Don Draper.
Yeah. And it's funny you should say that too, because when the film so the film begins in a kind of business room.
Yeah, it begins in a very oblique business room, not oblique, but minimalist.
Opaque? Oh yeah, okay.
Opaque.
Kind of like in the sense that you don't really know what's going on.
I know words. Yeah, and there's these 3 women, and they're sitting there.
His secretaries.
And they offer
Richard's secretaries.
Richard Dickey's secretaries.
Played by John Marley, is it? Who also plays, which I didn't realize, and I found out by reading the John Cassavetes textbook.
Wikipedia.com, a sponsor of this podcast.
That film producer who gets the horse head in his bed from The Godfather.
In Honey, I Shrunk the Kids.
Also in Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. Because if you shrink all those horse heads down, famine solved. Just like that.
I think the recurring joke for this episode is going to be Honey, I Shrunk the Kids.
Marty's just sitting there in the corner and he's sulking. He's
Marty,
like,
I don't have time for you.
I don't like all these references to movies that aren't my own.
It's very minimal. It's very there's nothing there except these 3 ladies who are all like, "Can I get you a coffee, Dickie?"
The light of cigarettes.
Yeah, and then one of them says he wants coffee, but then he doesn't. The way he says I don't want coffee, and then he says I want coffee, is like the perfect summation of John Cassavetes. Like, I don't want coffee. I hate coffee. Yeah. You better give me a coffee.
Also, why would anybody ever say no to coffee? It doesn't make any sense.
As a coffee drinker, when you see coffee served in those little cups, do you think, God, that's got to be the weakest cup of coffee?
Or the greatest cup of coffee, because it has to be served in such small doses. So, welcome to Coffee Chat.
So we're led to believe that he's a films executive?
No, well, but you don't find out until later that he's in finance.
I think that's a lie. I don't think that's true. I don't think that's true,
okay.
Unless he's in film finance.
That's the vibe I got. The other also interesting thing, which maybe at least kind of like addresses that, now the scene has moved to L.A., which you don't find out until much later on in the film. One of the characters says to another character, like, "Oh, what do you think about L.A.?"
But you knew they're in L.A. They're in L.A. from the beginning, aren't they?
Is there an exact reference to that? Because I just maybe
well,
missed the
Losers Cafe Bar, I think, was like a big L.A. But I don't know that for sure.
I did not catch.
But
the reference.
so the Draper comes in.
Shared cinematic universe.
Shared cinematic.
And they have some sort of kind of, again, very oblique discussion. I thought they were talking like ad men.
There was an old lady.
There was an old lady there. It's very kind of weird.
So maybe it isn't a film. Maybe it's like an ad man.
I thought it was an ad agency too.
That makes a lot of sense.
But that's funny that you should say that you thought he was lying to those Johns later about what he does. I guess just kind of like throw people off. But then they also have like that one person in common.
Yeah, that old lady too. There's also that old lady.
There's also the creepy old lady.
It's weird. So, but this might be in my mind. My mind might be a little bit of not a weakness of the movie, but I don't feel as though in later John Cassavetes movies, and granted I haven't seen everything, there's this sort of like not subtle but subtle critique of like capitalism.
Yes,
it's very like, okay, yeah, we get it. Like,
right.
This guy's a finance guy. He's lives in an alienated world. It's maybe that at the time felt very relevant,
right.
But now it's kind of like, business is bad.
Well,
hey, sure.
And so far, what we've seen, though, there's always been this kind of insider-outsider tension.
Right,
and
right,
that
right.
kind of manifests itself in a variety of different ways. And I get it, the whole, like, let's say, cliche of the artist or the person who's kind of, like, co-opted by the system or sells out, whatever it might be, and kind of how that kind of alienates him or her.
Are there any artists in this movie?
No, there aren't. Unless, again...
It's a big shift from the others.
If we take him to be some sort of kind of, I don't know.
Well, if he's a Don Draper type, but he's not the Don Draper type.
Not.
He's the money guy.
Yeah.
So and then well, I do like how it begins with the
screen. Yeah, it's kind of like very meta.
It's very meta, and
so
it
what
pulls
happens
you
is, they're sitting there, and again, you don't know exactly what it is that they're about to show these
Vodka's
people.
Great,
especially this. Oh, it's Grey Goose, right?
Water,
Top shelf.
water vodka.
Water vodka. And then they're all sitting in this room. They're about to unveil some sort of kind of either ad or film, and then a projector turns on. And then kind of like the camera.
It's also a little bit Ingmar Bergman-esque.
It is, yeah.
There's a little Bergman
Persona
quality to it. Or, and just the kind of like shadow puppet marionette. Maybe we should devote an entire fucking 2 years of our lives to Bergman.
I would love to go through the Bergman oeuvre.
You're not supposed to do that.
Can we make it through the Cassavetes oeuvre?
We gotta make it through the Cassavetes oeuvre. So it sets up this world of like kind of dominant masculinity.
He also has a great line here
servants.
that I wrote down where one of the, again, secretaries says something about like, "Oh, how are you feeling?" And says, "I could give you a list of my maladies."
Right.
It sounds very, very much like Beckett. So the film then, like, I guess officially then begins after you're introduced to this world.
Right.
Is it the birds? Are you paying?
No, it's a weird wind blast. And then we cut to Gina Rowland's. Gina Rowland's house.
Well, we cut to her apartment, and it's
a huge apartment.
Huge apartment, yeah.
The Cassavetes homestead, I believe. I think it was their home.
Good for them.
And Draper's there.
Fred Draper. Dickie,
and Gina Rowland's. I dream of Jeannie with the light brown hair. I'm available for bar mitzvahs.
I feel like this is the third episode in a row you've serenaded. I'm like, I'm digging it. I'm not complaining.
I'm only going to release this part of the episode.
Of course, yeah. Well, that's how we're going to get listeners.
You know what I noticed right off the bat?
Please tell me.
So they come in and they're all drunk. This movie has pretty realistic drunkenness.
It does, and it's interesting too. And maybe Marty can speak to a little bit about this, although he's been silent the last couple of times.
He's mad.
He sat down to record.
So jacked up on coffee right now.
I guess the other interesting thing about this and why I found it also interesting is because there is that kind of Cassavetes tension that permeates the entire film, whereby every conversation begins at a good place and eventually goes somewhere completely
and it's maniacal and insane,
awful.
Yeah.
And everything turns on a fucking dime. And it reminded me a lot because there is a moment too where one of the characters, I forget who it is, says something like, "Oh, do you think I'm funny?" Or maybe the opposite, like, "What, you think I'm not funny?" Oh wait, no, when they're in the bed, I think. When they're in the bed, we're skipping ahead.
You mean with Seymour Cassel?
No. Actually, when it's Dickie and his wife Maria,
who's amazing.
Yeah, who's amazing.
So fucking great.
But just the overall tension, which also permeates the scene. So they go back to Jeannie's place, or we don't see Jeannie, but this is kind of where we're introduced to her. We kind of come to the understanding that she's a sex worker because Fred is kind of like a dick to her at some point. They're all having like a good time.
So they're all drunk, and it's clear that Dickie has fallen in love with this woman
right
but
away.
We don't know how met. We don't know. I guess if she's a sex worker, they've picked her up.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess that's true. I didn't really think of it. I mean, of course.
Yeah. But you don't know that at the beginning of the scene. At the beginning of the scene, the three of them are just hanging out. You just assume that they're friends, that they're kind of partying after some sort of successful business venture, which we assume we saw at the very, very beginning of the film.
Right, and they're drunk.
And they're all kind of like playing around. They're dancing. They're singing. Dickie and Fred are talking about, I don't know, some like stupid routines they used to do. And yes,
this is about the point when I checked the time for the first point in the film. I wrote down this note, checked phone 11 minutes in.
And was it so? Okay, why though? Because I felt like this scene in particular, I thought was really powerful. There were a couple of moments that really drew me in, but yes,
no, there were definitely moments. But maybe it's the week or month or 2 years that we've had. But it's just hard to be like, you want to see my routine from high school? I hate women.
Yeah.
And I also this movie is.
I think we went to Georgetown Prep too, didn't they? And I think then Fred's like,
yeah, I actually think Fred's a Supreme Court nominee,
Supreme Court or Justice.
I did write down that these movies wash over you. Like you kind of have to just let them happen because there's no... I mean, we talked about this with Shadows. This movie has even less of a character arc kind of feeling than... It's just an endurance test of personalities coming up against you.
It's also in the name. I mean...
Apologies for the saw in the background. There's not much we can do about it.
That's Marty snoring.
He's building a house. He's building a little hut.
Yeah. Said he's working on sets for the sequel to Gangs of New York.
And I think that you almost have to approach a Cassavetes movie, especially these early ones, because they're not... This movie is stripped of any context.
Very much so.
In a way that the later films are not. Husbands has like a milieu. That's right.
Ooh, fancy.
It has you feel the Long Islandness of the characters and where they are.
Ew. The Long Islandness.
Same with the fact that you see Peter Falk at work in Women Under the Influence, which we'll get to. And I mean, what I think is the best one is Killing of a Chinese Bookie. Like these are all exist in what feels like real worlds. I mean, I've never been an ad exec, but the world of faces doesn't.
Well, I could tell you my 10 years in the ad exec business.
That's weird.
This is exactly.
I forgot you did that.
That's crazy. Still cashing all those Coca-Cola checks.
So this scene was... Let's come back. This scene was very compelling to you.
Oh, no. I just wanted to also say something about the title, because so much of the storytelling in this film is done through the power of the close-up. And there are so many great close-ups, especially of Jenna and Rollins. And I think she's
the greatest ever.
She's great. And there's also, by the way, can we also talk about the age kind of divide, which is really, really creepy.
How old is John Marley?
He's 60. He's 60. I looked it up on the John Cassavetes.
She's 29?
No, she's actually, I think, in her early 30s at the time. I think she's like 30. Well, her character, I think, is
28.
She says that she's 28.
But again, I don't know if you can trust anything that anyone says in these movies.
No, the Catcher in Her Lie, remember? Because she says like 28 and then she covers her mouth. And she's like, I mean 23. Right. So her character's supposed to be 28. I think she herself, in reality...
31, 32.
Is around...
He's probably 35.
And he's... Who?
Cassavetes.
Oh, Cassavetes, yeah. But Dickie's in his early 60s.
Dickie's 35.
He is...
He's a young man.
The ad business does age you.
Do you think that... The mask... This is a big question that might maybe be better answered, but there's just so much pummeling, painful maleness in this movie. And again, this is a conversation we could keep having. Yeah. Why did you find this scene compelling?
Why? Well, just because I think it sets up kind of obviously what happens later. And also we should say, and this is what we were saying earlier about like the symmetry of it, I think what's also compelling about this film too is that the women also get their turn. And we'll also talk about that moment as well, because they're like these really interesting inversions where the first kind of half of the film, it's all of these dudes hanging out with all these young women. And then at the end, or not the end, but the second half on, it's Maria and her friends who are hanging out with this guy, Chet played by Seymour Cassell.
Great. Best performance in the film, maybe?
Maybe,
He's incredible. You're not with me on that.
No. I was a fan of Chet. I just can't take anybody... Even a fictional character by the name of Chet is very seriously.
Name. What about Chet Baker?
All right, fine. But he's the only Chet I give a pass to.
What about Chet
Guevara?
Chet Guevara.
Well, it's actually Che, but...
What?
Yeah, didn't you know that?
God, I'm learning a lot recording this
Chet
podcast.
Guevara, though, some guy out in Nebraska, I'm assuming.
With really mean parents.
Oh, I was going to say Seymour Cassell.
Yeah.
Playing in Seinfeldian parlance, a mimbo. An amazing
he
mimbo.
Is a mimbo.
Yeah, he's a total mimbo. But going back to the early scene, I just found it interesting that it kind of sets up, obviously, what happens later. I felt like... I thought the tension and the creepiness of Freddy, I don't know, it just drew me in, man. I mean, like he's an asshole.
An interesting guy.
Yeah,
a lot of violence in that guy.
Totally,
a lot of violence in all these guys.
Yeah, it reminded me a lot of God, what's his name? George Costanza. The actor,
Freddy's
Jason Alexander.
Interesting.
Jason Alexander's creepy character in Pretty Woman. Another very interesting parallel. So he like quickly turns on Jenna Rollins when he realizes that Dickie is into
and there's a bit of a love triangle.
Jeannie, and Jeannie's into him.
Really good visual storytelling in this scene, just the way it cuts on them together and then cuts to his face.
And then he turns, and that's when he's like, "Oh, you're just like a prostitute, like you're worthless." And like Dickie kind of comes to her defense, and they kind of chase him away.
Right, and there's a bit. I wrote this down. There's a bit of him, like there's a bit of a feeling of him being like, "Don't spoil my fragile, toxic masculinity."
Yes,
like there's this feeling of like, "I'm a man," and that's like a recurring thing throughout the movie.
So okay, but this is what's also interesting, and again, we'll get to this maybe in detail. But later on, one of the first things that all the wives say to Chet, I don't know if you like noticed this, right? But they're like, "Oh, our husbands fear your youth. Our husbands fear your spirit." So there is this moment, and I thought like this is not that this is like an incredibly progressive or feminist film by any means, but there is a moment at least where this film kind of like gives the women a turn, right? Like puts them
and that's
in
what I was going to ask.
Positions of power.
I feel like there's a self-awareness. I don't know. This is all 40 years later or whatever, but 50. Fuck.
Oh, yeah, it is 50 years.
50 years. There's a part of you that like wants to believe that he's
this is an anniversary episode that's been commissioned
happy
by
anniversary. Yeah.
Estate.
Jenna called us.
She said, "Don't call me Gina."
She was like, "Please call me by my name. Call me by my name.
Call me by my name.
Call me by my name."
And you then kept calling her Liam, and she's like, "I don't get it."
Yeah, it was weird.
And you're like, "I thought we were doing this thing, you know, because call me by your name." Anyway, when the hell are you gonna be able to rent that on iTunes? By the way, iTunes
is it still not available?
Not for rental. No, you have to buy it, which is ridiculous.
Okay, calm down, Costanza. Calm down.
I'm so angry about this.
Yeah, the movie does not give the women short shrift at all. It's very sort of evenly paced out. I had a lot of trouble with the women's scenes, particularly the one with Mimbo, Seymour, Cassell, because it just feels very pathetic. And it's not that the scenes with the men don't feel pathetic, but there's that older woman who's just like the drunk girl, the one who's drunk, like everyone else is politely sipping their wine, and she's like wasted. And
it kind of also, spoiler alert, at the very, very end, I think reverses a lot of those kind of interesting politics by, again, making Maria this kind of really like over-the-top, hysterical woman who literally tries to commit suicide. And I think that kind of also kind of undercuts some of the earlier
with the
moments.
sleeping pills.
Well, because then it also kind of reminded me of this, with the sleeping pills. It also reminded me of Too Late Blues with Jess, who again like tries to commit suicide, has to be saved by the guy. And
she gets saved by a Mimbo who has unexpected depth in his final half of the film that he didn't have in the earlier scenes.
In Too Late Blues?
No, in this film.
In this,
Seymour Cassell has that speech where he's like, people just can't be vulnerable with one another.
Yeah, which is a great line, actually. I wrote it down. So then after Fred leaves, Dickie goes back home. Yeah. And it seems like actually they're living in domestic...
They have a good life.
They do,
They seem happy.
So I thought, because I knew the kind of the moment that kind of like really makes this film like begin is the moment where he goes back home and tells her that he wants a divorce. Yeah. Which does
sort
happen.
of the conflict.
Yeah, but before that there's like 15 minutes of what seems like domestic bliss, might be putting it too strongly, but they're definitely like enjoying their time, they're laughing.
Well, there's definitely an edge. There's definitely an edge to their interactions.
Yes.
And it's
there's a lot of drinking, a lot of cigarette smoking.
A lot of cigarette smoking. Opening the beers that were the old style Budweisers where you have to like really break the thing off. Right. It's great.
Because he comes home and is like, "Where are the cigarettes?" And she's like,
"Can I ask a question?
Smoked them all." Yeah.
There's a scene in the movie where he goes to play pool.
Yes.
And then it cuts to them in bed. Yes. And then it cuts to him in pool.
Right.
Does it cut back? Or looks like he's just leaving the room.
No, I thought it cut that. Okay, yes, it cuts back to him coming down from the stairs. So this is weird. You're right.
It feels like the flashback.
It cuts to him after they're like in bed. No, wait, no, not in bed. Sorry, before bed, he goes into the room to play pool
because she goes upstairs. So they've sort of
clearly a sexual metaphor,
right?
And then it cuts to them in bed, and they're like having a good time. They're rolling around in bed.
No one actually has sex. They just roll around in bed and laugh.
Which is funny you should say that too, because I was thinking, holy shit, if Cassavetes made these films today, there would definitely be I wouldn't want to say like over the top graphics,
Boning?
but I believe the scientific term is boning. Yes,
with no G, with apostrophe.
well, of course.
Yeah, sure.
As the adults say it.
But I wrote
you
down
almost see Chet's ass at the very end.
Scene
like,
number
wow.
5, was that a flashback?
I
thought it was a flashback.
I didn't take it as. You mean?
But then all of a sudden, why is he downstairs back in his shirt?
Because I assumed that was just him coming down. Like he gets dressed
To go back out.
They're in bed. They fool around. She comes down to make a drink. He's like, "Fuck this! I'm getting dressed. I'm asking her for the divorce." He comes down. He's dressed, and he's like, "I'm on my way out."
It really reads very. It really
does.
reads very funny.
No, it does.
I wanted to just make a quick note that we're probably 45 minutes into this 4-hour movie, and it's amazing how chatty it is without it losing any cinematic value. It still feels very visual. And I think part of that comes down to, this is a note I took later, the long speeches in the movie feel really natural. And that's because I think that Cassavetes is like an underrated editor, because I think he does the thing that really good filmmakers do, which is he doesn't go like, okay, let's just hold on this shot. Like, I think he combed the footage for reactions that would fit well, that don't always match, so to speak, or that are a little out of focus or whatever, but they add so much value to the film because they challenge sort of your like, it's always much more interesting to watch someone reacting to what someone's saying than watching them say it, because like there's what they call the dragnet style of editing, where it's like I speak and the camera's on me, and then you speak and the camera's on you.
Which is how we're filming this, actually.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. But it doesn't feel predetermined, and I felt that also in the jumping ahead after he tells her to the divorce, he goes to look for Jenna Rollins, and he goes to the music club, and there's this long montage music thing where it's like, this is the milieu. Second time. This is the sort of the universe.
Can we
that
get
these
a bell
people
to
exist
every time you say milieu?
Ding.
Put that in post-production.
And there's just lots of time devoted to looking at people looking around.
Yes.
Which is interesting.
Yeah, totally. No, I agree. I wanted to say something about the editing and I forgot. Oh, wait, maybe that's what I want to say. Yeah, I don't think that was a flashback, because I don't think there's anything that, not that a flashback is that like impersonistic, but there's nothing I think in this film other than that potential flashback that suggests anything like of that nature.
And and that's the thing that's why I question my own reaction to it, because there's a real linearity to his movies. Like these are essentially plays.
Yeah. Oh, they are totally. It's very much like being at the theater, except again for the power of the close-up,
which is great. I mean, like I think that more movies need to be like that. I think that like we're in like not now, but definitely a big drama thing for a long time was like adding an element of like audience irony, like the dramatic irony, like the audience knows something that the characters don't, and like he has no interest in that. He almost in some ways has no interest in an audience. I think
much
he
like
makes
us
films
with this podcast.
Exactly. We're inspired by John Cassavetes, and that we don't care what you think. So then we so there's a rupture in the story when he says he wants a divorce, and this sends them both off on like a kind of like odyssey, right? And he goes
to the Eyes Wide Shut,
and he goes to that scene where they're fucking is crazy. He goes to find Jenna Rollins. He checks 2 places. He has weird interactions with women at a bar. They kind of looking at him like, who's this old guy?
Yeah.
Because you forget he's 60 fucking years old.
Well, that's another thing too, because the film does address that tension also of kind of generational conflict, I think.
Right.
And again, like later on, those women, especially as you said, the kind of that older woman who wants to like clearly get down with Chet, because who wouldn't want to get down with a 30-year-old
Chet. Tight. He's tight. He's got muscles.
Seymour
skinny.
Cassell, yeah. He doesn't mind dancing.
He's a good-looking guy.
Loves dancing.
Good shoes. Good boots.
Good shoes. Very kind of sensitive soul.
Yeah,
also.
he's not. He's also kind of like a hipster.
Yeah.
A little bit. Yeah, man.
He totally
It's funny because I don't know how you feel about Seymour Cassell, but whenever I picture Seymour Cassell, I picture the scene in Rushmore when he says to Jason Schwartzman, "Do you want some money?" And I like start crying on the inside because it's like such an amazing.
It just destroys you.
And then it's like Seymour Cassell to me is like the dad from a million movies, and like what a fucking cool dude he was like 50 years ago.
Yeah,
it's crazy.
Oh man, if only you were my dad. So yeah, he goes looking for Jeannie. He calls her and he's like, "Hey, let's meet at this bar." And she doesn't go
because Jimmy McCarthy's in her house.
Because Jimmy McCarthy's
Brett Kavanaugh-esque friend.
Joe.
No, let's just call him Brett.
Yeah,
it's
we
Brett
call
Kavanaugh.
him Brett.
Yeah, call him Brett. So Jimmy McCarthy.
Check out the brain on Brett.
Check out the brain on Brett.
And
this scene didn't. So we now cut to Jeannie. Mm-hmm. She's with these guys and this girl who's her roommate.
Who seems to be either her roommate or her colleague.
Right.
And yes, they're entertaining Joe and Jim, who are again these like business type.
And
Bros.
I didn't think this scene made any sense for a while. I was like, what the... Because it's so similar to the scene that comes before it. Like, I don't think...
Well, it's really long,
Jimmy
too.
McCarthy is all that different from Fred Draper. Apologies on the wind, folks. We opened a window and...
it's a ghost.
Ooh,
it's our
the ghost of John Cassavetes. He has no liver.
So wait, so you just didn't... He just.
This was a scene that just really sat there. The scene really sat there for me until Jimmy
Dickie.
McCarthy brings her into the bedroom, and has this scene where he talks about his son, and how he's emasculated by his son,
right?
And how his son wears tennis shoes
because his son plays tennis.
He plays tennis at Dartmouth.
Yeah, he said,
"Fucking Ivy League loser."
He's like, I wanted my son to play football, but his mom said no, so now he plays tennis.
And then he runs, and then after he concludes the story, that's quite not sad, but you feel for him for a moment. He runs.
Does, yeah. Like, what is the thing? This is
closing the window.
Sorry, go ahead.
Closing the window. I'm gonna help. Hang on. This is teamwork. You guys are really
welcome to
WindowCast. Insight into our process. He then runs into the bathroom, messes up his hair, untucks his shirt, and runs out and is like, says to Brett Kavanaugh and this girl, like, "Oh, Jeannie, she's a good one."
Yeah.
Like he's had sex with her, and it's devastating.
Yeah.
It's painful.
This guy's a pathetic piece of shit. His boy Brett is also like just typical a-hole.
Can I write down a note? Can I tell you a note I wrote down?
Please.
And this was in reference specifically to Brett and Jimmy McCarthy. The guy you think is the worst in a John Cassavetes movie ends up not being the worst because you think Brett's the worst.
Yeah. Oh, you do? Yeah, no, totally.
But then it's very clear that Jimmy McCarthy's the worst. Brett's just like an ox.
About Brett. But then you find out that Jimmy's really the creepiest. And the creepiness factor gets ratcheted up once Dickie shows up.
And there's this weird bro-y confrontation that Dickie has no interest in, but he engages in.
And then they kind of do and there's this awkward fight.
Yeah, there's sort of an awkward wrestling match. I wrote down...
Over again, like, Jeannie's affections.
Yeah, and I wrote down, like... And this is like something I thought about from acting school.
Oh, of course.
Why does anybody stay in any room in this movie? Like, what's the compelling reason to stay in a... I think that's like a big difference with a John Cassavetes movie.
It's so funny you should say that too, because at some point I wrote down a note here about this being like John Cassavetes' version of Sartre's No Exit.
Fuck yeah.
Also because of like the intensity of the interiors.
Nobody wants to leave.
There's all this like claustrophobia. That final scene, or one of the final scenes, where Chet runs out of the house, I was like, that's one of the only exterior shots in this entire film, and it's interesting. It's a very liberating shot too, because he literally runs out into the sunset, like, or into the sunlight.
That shot is fucking incredible. I watched it 3 times because it doesn't cut, and he jumps off a roof and runs down a hill.
That's a good point. I did not.
It does not cut. I watched it 2 or 3 times.
Seymour Castella's own stunts.
Yeah. So,
but do you know that he also did some of the stunts for Vin Diesel in the first Triple X?
He actually did all of Sean Connery's stunts in Honey, I Shrunk the Kids.
Sean Connery.
Yeah. Why does anybody stay in this room?
Is Sean Connery in the director's cut of Honey, I Shrunk the Kids?
No, he's the kids. But yeah, why does anybody stay in the room? This scene is really long.
Because hell is other people.
What's really interesting? Okay,
we haven't left this room. We've just been recording it for the last week.
I wrote this down when we were watching it. People seem to get past how they feel about each other. Like there seems to be this sort of like, and then all of a sudden it's cool. But I actually think what ends up happening is Jimmy and... So this scene is full of lies. Everyone's lying to each other. No one's telling the truth about who they are and what they are.
Well, I didn't read in that cynical way, but sure.
At the end of it, they're like, I actually do think like the let's meet for lunch is genuine, because I think whether it's genuine or not, it's almost surreal. And I think there's this Cassavetes thing of like, again, men are always all about men.
Right.
Like it's a bromance.
It's very
kind
like
of
homosocial, yeah.
Homosocial.
Yeah.
Interesting.
To use a fancy word.
To come back to the interiors thing, the smarter people than us should maybe watch like a Chantal Akerman film like Jean Dielman against a film like Faces, because they're both such interior driven movies, and they're about interior spaces and to some extent interior spaces of the mind.
Quickly, can I derail this podcast? Jean Dielman, plot or no plot? I was trying to convince my students that there's no plot to this film, and they kept telling me, no, there's a plot.
No, there's a plot, there's no story.
Okay. Fair enough. But in an Aristotelian sense?
No, because there's unity of time, space, and action. There's time, space, and action. So
I suppose, yeah.
But there's no why in John Dielman, which is what a story is, right? Isn't it? Isn't the old adage? Let's ask the English professor. Yeah. Can we get Professor Fragopoulos.
Hold on while I put on my tweed jacket.
Isn't
with the patches.
I have one if you want to borrow it. Isn't the thing about plot is that the king died and then the queen died, and story is the king died and then the queen died because of grief.
Ah, that's not from Aristotle though, is it?
It's a Brecht thing, I think.
Oh,
sorry everyone. But there's no plot in this movie.
There's
this
no
movie's
plot in
all
this movie.
story.
Yeah. So they have this fight.
Is it?
They kind of then like reconcile in a weird way. They have a laugh about like knowing somebody. Is this also when Dickie complains to Jenna Rollins about all the leftists, where he's like,
it gets weirdly political.
Like, eating meat is a problem, but then he also says something about like I wrote it down here. A left winger or union organizer comes around and tells us that we all are born good. And obviously Dickie does not believe that. As a man of finance, this is also where he says to, right before they leave, he says to Jim that he is in finance.
Do you think Cassavetes is a political filmmaker?
I mean, I would think he would say that he's not, but clearly, obviously he is, in the sense that all aesthetic works are to some degree political.
Yeah, of course. Let's get into Christopher Nolan. No, but I think that's true.
That fascist.
But I think... but I think,
you brought it up.
But I think that he's political. I'd hate to say this, and there's people that'll contradict me because I'm probably wrong. But he's political in a way that I think people who say they're spiritual but not religious are political. Like, it doesn't feel deep to me in like he doesn't seem committed to a cause or a side or an idea. He seems to explore politics in relation to character, which is fine. But in the case of this, it feels very empty because like it's not that I necessarily. Dickie's the protagonist of the movie, if there's a protagonist. And it's not that I want to think good things about him, because there's clearly not great things about this guy. But the political elements of it feel so tossed into the film. And that
like those moments where
he
like complains about left-wingers and union
yeah,
organizers?
it's kind of like, yeah, okay.
Well, see, it's funny you should say that, because I think what Cassavetes would say is like, no, I'm not a political filmmaker. I'm a filmmaker, let's say, of the individual, but I would say that that's a politics. So like his obsession, let's say, with the individual and let's say these outsiders is obviously kind of like a political stance. And I think if you are going to say something about him being somewhat progressive, at least kind of in his overall politics, is the sense that these institutions, like marriage, like the business world, can be so fucking degrading
and dehumanizing. And that's a big part of what his films are about, is dehumanization, probably.
Yeah, and
his films are probably about.
That's a great thesis. I've ever read.
There was also a line, I want to start over again. He's like, has this long speech. And he says, and I have bad kidneys. And then they both start laughing, and it's like no one says anything seriously in a John Cassavetes movie. Like you spend a bunch of times identifying, and then he pulls it out from under you, and you're like, oh, fuck.
But I just read those as scenes of complete and utter despair.
Yeah,
these
they're
people
sad.
are just like, everything is pointless.
I also wrote down, this just isn't doing it for me. But I'd like to come back to my overall point, which is I think that this movie and all of his movies, they're not there to satisfy you. That's very obvious. But I also think in the details and in the particulars of watching them, he just doesn't give a fuck about how you feel.
Yeah.
Except that you feel. And I think that that's pretty exciting about his film. Like, yes, I think he would say I'm not political and I don't care like what you think of my work. This is the work I make, and that's still exciting.
So the scene ends with Jeannie's friend taking out Jim and Brett. They leave the apartment, and some of the dialogue they've already talked about kind of happens after.
Piper picked a pair of pickled peppers.
Later. Yeah, that's after they have sex in the morning. But so they leave.
No, but they say it the night before, don't they?
Do they say that? Maybe they do.
I mean, I think that Piper picked a pair of pickled peppers is a key line to understanding where their relationship. And I'm serious, because there's a big next morning.
There is a big next morning scene, but then it cuts. So then they have so then they leave.
And then
that's Brett. Bonin goes down, which again you don't see because 1968.
Right.
And then also this is where Jeannie has the line where she says, "You're a son of a bitch," and he's like, "Why am I son of a bitch?" And says, "Like, you're a son of a bitch because you get to me," which is, I guess, the kind of the closest that she gets to kind of revealing.
And this is after she's called Jim McCarthy a son of a bitch.
Yeah, and they leave. They spend the night together, and then it cuts to Maria, who is with her gal pals. Is going out to this.
Who are these gal pals?
We don't really know. We just assume
they
that
just
kind of
show up. Hold on one second.
Maybe one of them was Louise. Louise was the woman that Maria was talking to on the phone when Dickie first comes home.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah. So it's Maria, who now obviously has been told that her husband wants a divorce, and she is also looking for some young flesh, and she finds it in the figure of Chet.
There's a long dance scene where they watch him dance, and I think I was nodding off during it.
I love the music that was playing here, but
this is a nice moment because there's actually some joy in these movies, and it's the joy of watching people who are not stuck in their interiors. Right. Every scene that takes place outside of their homes are happy.
That's a good point.
Or let's say contrast with the interior
world. There's a potential for happiness,
which is interesting because that's going to be something that's going to come up in husbands in some ways, I think. Like, it's almost like his characters need a reprieve from their lives by going to social spaces, which is like the reality of alcohol and socialization and stuff like that in general. Socialization, not like the act of being socialized, but more like being social and going into the... In case you guys were confused by my big word.
I was not.
No, some people.
And then it cuts to... So they kind of pick up Chet. It's Maria and her three friends.
And they're back in the house.
Back in her house.
Can I make a note?
Because I was a little confused here.
Something that I thought was interesting.
Is it about all the... I wrote here, excellent white people dancing in the club? Is that what you want
the
to tell
dancing was good. No, I think there's... this is the strength of him as a director in this moment, because you manage to understand a lot about their relationships through the way they relate to Chet in front of each other.
Cool.
Which I think...
No, sorry, I thought you were going to say something
cool.
No, I think... Is there a particular moment that you're...
It's just that, like, how desperate the older woman seems to be, and how the other woman puts on this air of being affected. And like, clearly...
Oh, she's like, the one that's like, I went to college.
Yeah, Lynn Carlin's like, you fucking... Like, you almost feel like she's disgusted by your friends, because they all kind of leave.
They do.
The
two of them
drop
leave.
Off.
The one kind of like stays behind a little longer, and she has like this moment with Chet, and she's like obviously desperately wants to like spend the night with him, but he's kind of like, I'm not like doing this, and then he offers to kind of take her home.
But then he comes back
for Maria, because he's clearly into her. And this is also, again, like we were talking about, like the inversion too, of like the first half of the plot, because again, first half of the plot or of this movie, it's guys like Dickie and Brett, and I just love that we're still fucking calling him Brett and Jim.
Yeah, suddenly we're getting the sort of the female side.
Yeah,
if that's an appropriate thing to say.
They were hanging out obviously with these much younger women, and now it's like these older women hanging out with this one much younger man.
But Lynn Carlin doesn't.
She's actually very young.
She's got to be like
she's in her 30s. I looked that up too. She's a very age inappropriate wife.
Well, she's so age inappropriate.
But don't you think she's supposed to be playing somebody that's at least a decade older? Like clearly Seymour Cassel is supposed to be like in his early 20s.
She's perfect in the movie.
She is. No, she's amazing.
But she doesn't read as older.
On
a very superficial level.
Yeah. But she's clearly still older, if not by a lot, older than
So she
Chet.
sleeps with Chet.
Yeah.
And then it cuts to the morning. And I think that this is, I think this is interesting. I think a lot of great movies do this thing of you see the drunken revelry of the night and then the hangover the next day.
Yeah.
Like it's an instant structural because the next morning we then cut back to Dickie and Jenna Rounds. Am I going too fast?
No.
And they're sort of like in the light of day, and she makes him eggs, and the eggs are terrible. And
well, he also has this great line. He's like, I've been seduced.
Yeah. God, it's such a good... There's a little bit of like Beckett, like you said. There's a little bit of like this like sort of like... I don't know if what people say in these movies is what they feel or what they think. I don't know what's going on.
It's also really interesting too, because then I also thought, I was thinking about like the transactional nature of that, of them having sex. And I was like, huh. Because I thought there was going to be a scene where like he tries to offer her money, and that's where like he insults her or something. But he insults her because of the eggs.
I don't think John Cassavetes would ever show that scene where he offers her money, and he's like, I just feel like it's not.
Why?
Because I think he would find another way to do it, which is what he's done. Which is the eggs, exactly. Yeah. So I'm agreeing with you. I'm agreeing with you. Don't look so angry, guys. The rage in George's eyes right now is unbelievable.
If we weren't in such a fine
there was
studio,
a line here, and I did a really bad job of writing it, but I thought it was sort of key to I think I spend a lot of time trying to figure out what he's trying to say in these films, which might be a waste of time. Mm-hmm. But there's this thing about like they're talking about like real things, and she's like, oh, it's like all of it's blah blah blah.
Huh? I don't remember.
And it's like defensive song something. I wish I'd done a better job writing down. But there's this sort of feeling that like they start to have a serious conversation, And
then
neither one of them wants to have a serious conversation. And then it goes back to the Peter Piper picked a pair of pickled peppers.
Oh, right, yeah.
And then she walks off, and then he comes in and he's like, hey, Jeannie, Peter Piper picked a pair of pickled peppers. And he says it, and you feel that they go back into this fantasy world where the consequences and implications of their choices don't matter. It's still the night of sex and revelry and drunkenness, and you don't know if it's a weekday or a week, whatever. Like, does he have to go to work?
He doesn't have to go to work, clearly.
Yeah, I don't, or maybe he does.
Those financiers, they don't really work.
They just steal from the rest of us.
From the rest of them, right?
This podcast brought to you by Marx.
Welcome to Revolutionary Podcasting.
Speaking of,
but I also find that like Peter Piper, I can say it, Piper.
Peter Piper picked a pair of pickled peppers.
I also found that as a very kind of again, these moments of false kind of childhood or childish kind of enthusiasm and joy, where they're again kind of like just enjoying each other's pleasure or company.
Well, it's nonsense. It's nonsense
because it also kind of replicates the nonsense, the joke making between him and Maria earlier in the film when they're in bed, and they're like cracking jokes about Freddy's infidelities and about kind of his shitty kids or whatever it is that they're making jokes about.
Oh, yeah, they go after Freddy hard.
They go after Freddy hard, yeah. So I just found it was kind of almost like endearing, but yeah, it's this kind of, as you said, it's clearly covering up some kind of greater trauma or this refusal to accept or to confront the reality
and that
situation.
Might in and of itself be the political commentary that this is not a guy that wants to go back to the reality of his existence and how his life is defined by work and booze. And so to jump ahead a little bit, so go ahead.
Oh, no, sorry. Oh, but so did we mention the eggs? So she makes eggs for him.
She makes eggs.
And he just complains about the eggs being shitty.
How can you make shitty eggs?
Yeah, which is, I think, exactly what he says.
I think you can overcook eggs.
She then...
Welcome to Eggcast.
Yeah, she then throws them... at the end of this, wait for our amazing omelet recipe. She then...
You want to make sure to take the pan off the heat and put it back on repeatedly. But don't salt the eggs when you're cooking them. It breaks up the
what
fat.
Kind of barbarian would salt eggs while they're cooking? That makes no sense.
But she makes it, and that sort of sets off this, and like, you know,
so she goes into the kitchen. Sorry, she goes into the kitchen. She throws away the eggs, and it's a great scene because again, there's like somewhat of a close up, and she's crying.
Oh my god! And the camera pushes in on her. A lot of zoom lenses in this movie, which you know is by like a traditional
zoom. Were you watching the
same? Zoom.
I know I was.
Zoomy. A lot of sort of like a cinematic faux pas, but he really utilizes them quite well. Yeah, so they have this fight, but then they sort of return to the naivete with the Peter Piper picked a pair of pickled peppers, and then we cut to a shot of Maria on the floor having attempted suicide.
Correct.
And Seymour Cassel in this like incredibly edited scene of physicality where he like tries to wake her up by putting her in the shower. He makes her some kind of drink that causes her to throw up, and then finally sticks his fucking finger in his mouth. And
he also smacks her a couple of times because it's John Cassavetes' film.
He also calls 911 and asks for the emergency rescue squads, which I didn't know the specific branch.
ERS.
Yeah, can I get the emergency rescue squad?
But it's great. They're like, okay, what's your number? And then he just hangs up on them.
Right. Well, I think
he's like, holy shit,
she's in trouble. Yeah. There's a quote from John Cassavetes that where he says, "Silence is death."
Ooh. Deep.
But and it's kind of annoys me as a quote because it's like, what are you talking about? But he spares us the sound of her gagging until the very, very end when she throws up.
I'm glad you mentioned that too because I was like, it was that.
I'm doing an impression. Can you describe?
So Liam's sort of kind of gagging, but not quite. Yeah, there it goes.
Included the sound, but you don't hear it.
I thought that was like an editing thing.
I think it might have been
in the sense of like the censors. I was like, oh no, we can't have her gagging too much.
Oh, interesting. I don't know.
Or also just maybe bad audio.
Yeah, well, I mean, they didn't have a lot of money for this thing.
Yeah,
but there's an absence of sound design in this, but I think it's intentional. Like he would use the raw mono tracks in like Prince of Films because he didn't want it to be overly designed.
Produced, yeah. So punk.
So fucking punk.
So then she pukes, and it is an amazingly shot.
It's really well done.
It's like one single shot of a couple of us.
And then she kind of wakes up.
She wakes up,
and
he's kind of like thrilled.
But then he has this speech about how people can't be vulnerable with one another. And
was that then, or was that?
No, it's right then.
It's right then,
or soon after. And it's an interesting moment in the film because if there's a overarching theme to the movie, I don't know what it is. It seems to be a movie that's about domesticity, and I actually ultimately...
You know how terrible it is?
And routine.
Somebody talks about... Doesn't somebody say something about the banality of doing the same thing day in, day out?
That was you. You said that earlier.
Maybe that was me.
Yeah, there's probably something of that in there. But, also kind of the way that people... Especially, I feel like this was probably a really strong feeling in 1968. Just the feeling of like... politically, the world is in chaos.
Totally.
And granted, he started shooting the movie years before, but I wrote down Seymour Cassel teaches the lesson in this movie. Like, there's this feeling that he has a commentary about vulnerability, and he's probably the most open character in the film. He's certainly the most concerned with other people's well-being that we see in the course of the movie.
Yes, I'm just trying to think of I think Jeannie also, like, she opens herself up, and they're like doing interesting parallels. They're like
Jeannie, you mean Jenna Rowlands?
Yeah.
And God, she's so good. Could we just do a podcast about how good Jenna Rowlands is?
We could. Jenna Cast.
We got to come up with a new joke.
Talking Rowlands.
Talking about my
Rowlands.
Jenna Rowlands.
It'd be amazing too, because
I know Pete Townsend. I could get him to.
I just how quickly would that cease and desist letter come?
So quick. It already is. It's in the mail. I just got it.
It's like, wait, we haven't even posted any of these.
But he has a speech about, I wish I'd written it down in detail, but it's like, people can't be vulnerable with one another.
Well, I tattooed it on my back last night, so if you want to...
All right, Leonard Shelby. Is that the second Memento commentary?
No, well, you said something about the fascist Christopher Nolan earlier, even though Memento, amazing fucking film.
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's his best. It's good.
I wouldn't say it's his best, but it's great.
We all know it's The Dark Knight
film?
Rises. No, it's the second film. His first film is a film called Following, which I highly recommend you watch. So after Seymour Cassel revives and has this speech about vulnerability, which I think is key to understanding the movie, Dickie comes home, Cassel jumps out a window, and what I think is an absolutely astonishing shot that I don't think they had a stunt coordinator for, and I was like terrified about because he runs down like a 40-foot hill and runs down the street
shirtless.
And this is the final few minutes of this movie are amazing.
Yes, that shot of them on the stairs,
because I think they're a little bit of a talk about a Beckett moment, because my feeling in the final, so they sit on the stairs, she lights a cigarette, he lights a cigarette, he hands her the lighter, he walks upstairs, takes off his jacket, she walks upstairs, puts on a nightgown, and then they both walk in separate directions and the movie ends. This to me implies that this has happened before and it's going to happen again.
Oh, that's really interesting.
I feel like that what the final reveal in this movie is like, oh, this is something they've just done before.
But why?
I don't know. Maybe, again, it could be my like need to find some kind of overarching idea or something, but it just doesn't feel, it feels so pedestrian. And the final moments of the movie feel pedestrian in the sense that it's like, well, what are we going to do now?
Not with a bang, Liam, but with a whimper, am I right? Right.
Amen. No, but it really, I think that's true. It's kind of like, what do you do after you've both cheated on your spouse and are, left your hell as other people?
Yeah. He's surprisingly kind of, not that there isn't some anger in the scene when he returns back home and he realizes that she hooked up with Chet, but he's also surprisingly chill.
Yeah.
I thought there was going to be a really, really awful moment of violence, and there is some violence because he throws her.
But it's almost, he throws her and he's like, would you want me to hit you every time you open your mouth?
Or something like that.
But it's almost him being like, I'm not this way, which I think he isn't that way.
They're both resigned. That I read it as they're both resigned to the shittiness of their situation. And then, in fact, it will, the walking away, I think, is what, to me, suggests that they're not going to reconcile. That there's, in fact, an actual... Yeah. Like, if that scene maybe ended with both of them walking upstairs... I think that would be totally different.
Interesting. I see it as maybe we're going to repeat a pattern later in life. To wrap it up.
Let's do it.
Where do you see this? So far we've watched Shadows, Johnny Staccato, A Child is Waiting, and Too Late Blues. What are you starting to sort of see emerging as like a consistent?
Yeah, well, again, the constant kind of themes of family, the oppression of kind of social institutions, whether they're the business world, whether they're domesticity, marriage, and kind of
love and marriage, domesticity, marriage, alcohol.
Lots of alcohol. lots of smoking.
Right, almost
also
escapes
totally
from institutionalization.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Yeah, there's attempts to kind of like get out, to like break free for a moment. And that's what's also so powerful about Husbands, that it's like
Next up.
It's an entire bender. Like the film is just about them going on a bender, trying to get away from what they see as like their shitty lots in life.
Right. No, absolutely. It's an interesting time to be watching these movies in light of what's going on culturally, and just
it very much is. And it also makes them in a very certain way really uncomfortable.
Yeah.
There's that terrible scene in Husbands. We'll talk about it obviously when we get to it. But,
which is next.
Well, there's two terribles, because I know what terrible scene you're thinking about, but I think about a different terrible scene.
Are you thinking about the terrible scene towards the beginning, maybe first 40 minutes, versus the one in the hotel room in London towards the end?
Oh no, I was thinking about more about the one in the hotel room.
The never ending scene.
Yeah.
In the hotel room.
I'm like,
yeah, I think that in addition to being like talking about thematically, like domesticity or routine, I think that's and the escape from and all these things and kind of the ways that we've
John
been
Carpenter's
conditioned.
Escape from Domesticity.
Oh, I love that film.
It's
written by Chantal Akerman. But I think one thing that Cassavetes, and to relate to my comment of these things washing over you, I think one thing that he does differently than many, many other filmmakers is they point to their themes, whereas he like immerses you in the reality of it. Like, he's not a guy who's like understand the themes intellectually, though I think there's an intellect to what he's doing, but it's more just like, this is what it is. Like, it is that existential Jean-Paul Sartre. Sartre, that works. Great. Thing of like,
you say Sartre, I say Sartre.
You say Sartre. There's a certain quality.
There is, no, totally.
You're living these situations. You're not escaped. You're not removed from them.
And I had to go back and see when Sartre wrote No Exit.
47?
44. I think 44 in French. I don't know when it was translated to English. But these films, and I think that kind of like
especially this one.
Yeah, I think that kind of era of, let's say, New York intelligentsia that's been very much influenced by French existentialism. That seems like by the late 60s. I would assume it's kind of like already
exhausted.
Gone. Yeah, but there is
Who
so
are you
much
talking
of that here.
about?
I don't know. I'm thinking about people like Mary McCarthy and like Lionel Trilling. There's like partisan review people, which I think, I mean, again, I don't know the exact dates for this, but I think that the heyday of those kind of journals, or that journal in particular, was like 40s and 50s, and that kind of New York intelligentsia.
So cinema kind of filled that void.
Yeah, or maybe just kind of, obviously we're just talking about one filmmaker at the time.
A filmmaker that at the time no one cared about. And it's interesting to come back to, this film was nominated for 3 Academy Awards.
3, count them.
Best Supporting Actress.
Which is kind of amazing.
Best Screenplay and...
Best Chet?
Best Seymour, Best Chet. No, Best Supporting Actor, Seymour Cassell. I think he would be nominated for 1 Oscar, maybe. Maybe Gina Rowlands would be nominated for A Woman Under the Influence, but...
Cassavetes was nominated for Dirty Dozen the year before.
Yeah, but like, so this film almost, it's interesting, it says something to his, I don't want to sit around and just like fillet John Cassavetes, but... what do you want to? But like, it's interesting.
It's a very interesting turn of phrase.
It's just interesting that this is what happens next for him. He does Dirty Dozen, gets nominated for an Oscar,
and then does this,
and then finishes.
Oh,
this
you mean
movie.
in a certain sense of like, fuck
I'm
going to do my own thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think he had been working on this before that, so it doesn't really matter. But
well, yeah, when they started filming, I think John Marley was only like 40. So
John Marley actually played Seymour Cassell. They shot that stuff first.
They had to recut everything.
Yeah, they were like, oof. But I think that definitely you can see the influence in this thing in like any film about like modern day alienation.
Yeah, I didn't enjoy this as much as Shadows.
I don't think you're sort of meant to.
And also like the time also it's like, because Shadows is so much brisker.
This feels very dated. It actually feels more dated than Shadows.
In certain ways, it does. Yeah.
Do you think that might have to do with the fact that there's this movie's all white people? There's like so much more diversity in Shadows, and that it doesn't feel as caught up in the like white like upper class angst. Milieu angsty thing, where Shadows feels like it's grappling with stuff that feels more genuine and more contemporary.
I've kind of had it. Had it with like rich white people exhaustion.
Next up on the Oeuvre Busters, Husbands.
Well, but those characters strike me as being more like middle class, and
Yeah.
like this guy's like some rich fucking financier, and they're talking about like we didn't mention this, but like Jim at some point says something like, "Oh, I import or I sell aluminum and brass or some shit like that."
Yeah.
like these are the type of rich, and he mentions that
That guy's a traveling salesman.
because he says something like,
too.
"I make $250,000 a year." Back in 1968.
Yeah. That's what I make.
Yeah.
Now.
I mean, who doesn't, right?
Yeah,
all podcasters.
All podcasters make it. All
so.
right.
Yeah, so part of me is kind of like, fuck these people. Whereas, again, like the people in Shadows are like down on their luck bohemians who have obviously huge other fucking like structural issues that they have to deal with, like
really
racism. So, yeah, there's a certain way in which that doesn't feel dated. Like the politics of that are in a way more present than the politics of this because, again, to some degree, like I'm not really interested in like the rich white people. That's why, for example, like the most sympathetic characters are Chet and Gina, or Jenny, Jenny,
Jeannie. I dream of Jeannie with the light.
And they're clearly the ones that are the younger ones. They're the millennials.
They kind of are. Even though people in 1968 who are approximately our age, younger than us,
grow up to
feel
vote for
like
Trump.
they're in they're 45.
Oh yeah, and then
like
eventually grow up to vote for
Isn't
Trump.
it weird to like watch them? I'm 35. I still watch movies and I'm like, those people are so old,
You're
and
that
oftentimes
young?
they're younger than me.
Fuck yeah.
How old are you? 37?
No, 37, soon to be 38. What?
Oh yeah, Saturday.
Yeah.
Why are we talking about this?
I don't know.
Should we wrap it up?
Yeah, I thought
Happy
we were doing
birthday,
that.
George. Yeah, let's.
Thank you.
Well, I mean, like, end it.
Oh, sorry.
Should
officially,
we end it?
Yeah.
So next week or 2 weeks.
2 weeks. Husbands. Let's do this.
I'm gonna say a husbands with then a slice of the Dick Cavett.
Oh,
I think we should talk about both.
Totally. Let's do
Whether
it.
we do husbands and then like a bonus 20 minutes on.
Maybe we should do that.
On.
Isn't this really
Dick
exciting
Cavett?
for you guys while you listen to us plan?
I think it's good. It gets you behind the scenes.
Behind the scenes.
All right.
Wait, do we want to give Marty
Anything? Marty.
any final words, Marty? He's just.
He's upset.
Oh, I think he mouthed "silence is death," so, which is a great way to end.
Next time, husbands. You're George Fragopoulos,
And you're Liam Billingham.
and this
Is Ouvre Busters.
you said it again. Happy birthday
Oh, we're singing
to you, John Cassavetes. Happy birthday to you, John Cassavetes. Happy birthday, dear John. Happy birthday to you.
And many more. Well, actually,
he's
no, he's dead.
I am.
It's so sad.
We have to talk off mic about your singing because that really threw me off.
I was fucking killing it.
Happy birthday, John Cassavetes. We miss you every day.
Also, that took a really